We are now recording. All right, so I'm again so excited to be here for Mallory's talk. Mallory Sharp is going to be, Mallory, give us a wave. Hey, everybody. Mallory's talk today is going to be Performance and Pedagogy, the Hampton Pageant. Mallory is a Ph.D. candidate in the history of art and architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She received a Bachelor of Arts in History at Harding University, a Master of Arts in, excuse me, in History at Indiana University, and she studies African diaspora art history, and her talk today is a part of the ongoing research for her dissertation. She lives here in Memphis. She is working to complete her Ph.D. later this year, and I have had the pleasure of working 2 times with Mallory. Once, she was my intern when I was working in the development department at the Dixon, and she came back to us this last year and worked with us in the curatorial department. We're so excited to have you. I'm so excited to learn today. I'm going to turn it over to Mallory Sharp. Thanks, Mallory.
Thank you so much, Karen. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen in just a minute, but first, I just want to remind you from what Karen said that what I'm going to be talking about today constitutes one of the central topics of my dissertation. So I offer this not as an excuse, but really I would love to hear feedback because this is a work in progress, and I'd love to know if there's something you'd like to know more about or that you found confusing, because all of this is really helpful for me as I'm in the process of writing. You know, it's so easy for those of you who've worked on large writing projects before to get really focused in your narrow subject area, and it's easy to take for granted stuff that you know really well that might not be familiar to other people. So I'd love get questions or comments related to that today as I give you my presentation. Okay, so I'll try to share my screen. Also, I'm having some limbs trimmed off of a tree in my backyard today, and so far it's not been loud, so I'm hoping the trend will continue. Okay, can everyone see my PowerPoint? For those of you whose faces I can see? Okay, great. Okay, so I'm not really going to talk about this very much, but you'll notice at the bottom how I describe the school as Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. So just because I'm not going to touch on this later, I wanted to go ahead and say that if you're not familiar with the term normal school, that's just a term that used to be given to educational institutions where people would be trained to become teachers. So I know it looks kind of funny because we use the word normal to mean something different, but that's what it means. Okay, so the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute, which today still exists, but it's called Hampton University, was founded in the coastal town of Hampton, Virginia, which you can see on this map, in 1868. Like many historically Black colleges and universities, which sometimes you'll hear people refer to them as HBCs or HBCUs, Hampton was founded to educate the formerly enslaved. From its inception, Hampton created a museum space for its students, and it was the first museum at any historically Black college, as well as the first American museum, period, in any space to collect African American art. Until the 1920s, the Hampton Museum was also one of the only museums in the South that Black Americans were permitted to visit. That's the time period that we're looking at today. By the 1890s, the collection had grown into a significant repository for African art in addition to African American art. Objects acquired by Hampton alumni who served as Protestant missionaries on the African continent formed the backbone of this collection that still exists today. So today in my talk, I'm going to analyze the participation of some of Hampton's students in what was called a folklore pageant, but today we would think of this pageant as more of something like a play, but the term they used back then was pageant. So I'll be talking about that and considering how the continent of Africa and the idea of what Africa was, how that was framed for the needs of the school during that time period. So while the impact of colonial and American missionary work in West and Central Africa has been addressed extensively in scholarship, the reverse, which is to say how missionary work in Africa shaped American institutions, has been considered far less. So in looking at the Hampton pageant, I'm hoping to examine the nuances of the larger phenomenon of the missionary pageant, which I'll talk about today, and how that relates to African American and white American participation in the creation of a concept of Africa. And this is an early photograph of the Hampton Museum in 1905. So you can just kind of get a feel for what that space would have looked like in the time frame that we're discussing today. So this photographic representation of the Hampton pageant is one in a series of 4 photographs that I've been able to locate doing research in the archives there in Hampton. So along with these images, the only surviving evidence that this event ever even occurred is a written description found in a June 1913 edition of the Hampton Schools newspaper, which was called the Southern Workman. The event depicted is a pageant or a play that took place as part of the 45th anniversary celebration of the founding of the Hampton Institute. This is 1913. So in the photograph, you can see an outdoor elevated stage that's set with thatch roof dwellings, fixing the location of the pageant subjects, not in Virginia, but it's meant to represent somewhere in distant Africa. Several baskets, bowls, and other daily wares are arranged in groups across the stage floor. And in the foreground, you can see, can you see my cursor? I hope, okay, right here, there's a pile of furs and textiles. So the student actors are outfitted in imitation African costumes that are suggestive of traditional bark cloth wrappers. So it's a very traditional type of fabric that's just kind of wrapped around the waist or wrapped like around the torso. And many students also wear necklaces and bracelets. And perhaps most notably, 10 of the students you can see in this photograph are holding spears and shields, and their faces are painted with swirls of bright paint. Both the attire of the student actors and the objects that are used to set the stage or the things that they're carrying and holding suggest a level of awareness, however superficial that might have been, of African visual and material culture that was most likely informed by the objects that were in the museum's collection. In 1911, the Hampton Museum purchased over 400 objects from former student William Henry Shepherd. Shepherd had by this point served for many years as a Presbyterian missionary to the Belgian Congo Free State, which today we would call that the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So this is a map of what Africa would have looked like in 1912, and you can see the arrow to the Belgian Congo. So that's Central Africa is what we're looking at. So Shepherd's collection, which largely represented the art of the Kuba peoples, K-U-B-A. The Kuba are a people group in a region in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And this collection was the first of its kind to exist outside of the African continent anywhere. So it's pretty significant. The Shepherd collection, which I said earlier, consists of approximately 400 objects that are mainly from the Kuba and then Kuba affiliated people. They range from prestige items to everyday objects. And because Shepherd was concerned with creating a vivid picture of the Kuba and the way they lived their life, he intentionally collected a really wide assortment of items. He believed that nothing besides the artwork that he collected could convey a more complex or more complete sense of Kuba culture to an American audience than these objects themselves. So the collection, as you can see in this photograph from 1900, includes carved wooden objects, textiles, masks, weapons, and ironwork. It also contains divination tools and the rattles of hunting dogs. From the moment that Shepherd began to assemble his collection, he intended to bequeath it to Hampton. And you can see him in this picture here. He's the one wearing like European or Western style clothing. So from the moment he began to assemble this collection and started to collect objects from where he was living within the Congo, he had planned to bequeath his collection to Hampton eventually at some point. So the sale of his collection to his alma mater has been pretty well documented, but the personal story of William Shepard has been largely overlooked until the last couple of decades. And perhaps this is because he was a Black man. There is evidence suggesting that Shepard was the first person from the United States or Europe to enter the Cuba capital. So his visit to this area predates Belgian colonizers or Western ethnographers. Shepard's time in the Congo region is not a typical colonial narrative for many reasons. He appears to have been genuinely interested in Congo culture and languages, and he was an advocate for the rights of the people there. Shepard was a vocal opponent of European colonialism in the Congo, and he became pretty well known and famous during his lifetime for his written account that helped to bring global attention to the atrocities of the Belgian rubber companies. If any of you are familiar with the book, or I think there may have been a documentary as well, King Leopold's Ghost, that book covers this libel trial. So Shepard's kind of a character in that story. So Shepard's criticism of what he called crimes against humanity, and this is actually the origin of the term crimes against humanity, it comes to this rubber trial in Belgium, led the leading rubber company in Belgium, the Kasai Rubber Company, to sue Shepard for libel. So he ended up winning his trial, but the publicity that surrounded the event arguably ushered in the beginning of an American critique of European colonialism, as well as some European critiques of European colonialism too. So over his 20 years in residence in the Congo, his peaceful, relatively uneventful interactions with the Cuba facilitated his ability to assemble a large and impressive collection of art. So among the royal objects that Shepard acquired, I just wanted to give you kind of some examples. One of the most significant is this object that's on the left of your screen. It's a 17th century knife that the Cuba Lukanga, which is their term for the king, presented to the missionary on the 4th day of his visit to the Cuba capital. So the knife consists of an elaborately carved wooden handle that you can see here and a symmetrical curved blade. Shepard recounts that the Lukanga told him that the knife had been passed down through 7 generations, and so this would make this knife the oldest object in the Shepard collection. So here's a few more things from the collection. These are more recent photographs, as you can tell from the color. So a spectacular example of a mask found in his collection, which we call a Mukanga mask. And this type of mask would be worn at the funerals of initiated and titled men. So it's visual elements. You can see the elephant trunk kind of tusk, these kinds of shells that we call cowrie shells, and then the leopard skin elements here in the back. Part of it, those are all symbolic of wealth and status. And then this right here is a shield, which might look familiar as something that inspired the students who participated in the pageant. And this is from the Ngala peoples. And then this is just an example of a bark cloth wrapper that's been unfurled at the far left. So although Shepard had begun to acquire some of the objects that would eventually be part of this collection 20 years before it came to Hampton. So he starts collecting in the 1890s. It doesn't come to Hampton until 1911. His correspondence with the founder of Hampton suggests that Shepard was specifically gathering the pieces and choosing which pieces he wanted to collect because he wanted them to benefit the students at Hampton. Shepard kept fastidiously detailed records of the functions, customs, and practices associated with each object, further suggesting his desire for the collection to be an educational tool for the students. Prior to giving the collection to Hampton, Shepard incorporated many of the objects as visual aids in his own lectures and demonstrations. He presented examples of Cuba art to legitimate his encounter with the people, so to literally be able to tell people, I have actually been here and I have met these people, I know these people, and to provide just a point of visual interest for his audience that he hoped would encourage donations to his mission. So Shepard's own practices proved foundational to the many years of hands-on interaction with his collection and arguably inspired Hampton's own early 20th century pedagogical and fundraising procedures. As Shepherd intended, Hampton's archives reveal lots of records of teachers and students alike interacting with his collection. As well as offering visually stimulating material for the students, the collection provided teachers with tangible examples that enabled them to draw cross-cultural comparisons between the traditional arts of Africa and those in the United States. So this is a photograph you can see of students in a domestic science course, and they're looking at Kuba, raffia, and bark cloth textiles. And then you can see in the background, there's a leopard skin that's hanging up. So during this period, Black intellectuals were debating the merits of an industrial versus a liberal arts educational model. Hampton was founded on the industrial model in which students would be trained in the arts of teaching, sewing, carpentry, agriculture, and mechanics, rather than receiving liberal arts educations. So the museum's first curator, which she's the woman in the center of this photograph, this white woman, her name is Cora Folsom, and she felt it was extremely important for the students to be exposed to the, quote, skillful and artistic work of Shepherd's collection. So this photograph is also useful to introduce a concept that I'm not going to talk about a lot more today, but that's relevant as far as educational practices during this time period are concerned. So this concept was called the object lesson, and it's a visual pedagogy that encourages learning based on observation and experience that occurs when a student comes into direct contact with an object. And at the turn of the 20th century, using an object lesson was popular in both religious education as well as starting to become popular in some American museums. And I think this photograph is a good illustration of an object lesson in action. Also writing in 1917, Cora Folsom, this curator, argued that interaction with African art would, quote, engender race pride, as well as provide a clearer and broader idea of geography and history, agriculture, and the trades than the students could get from books alone, end quote. So therefore, exposure and access to Shepherd's collection was meant both to encourage students and to inspire their own efforts. So in the historical moment that I'm focusing on today, the Shepherd acquisition was what formed the greater part of the museum's collection to that point. And the assembled objects of the museum proved useful for Hampton's industrial education and additionally provided inspiration for things like school pageants and performances. So a detailed description of the pageant appears in a 1913 issue of the Hampton Schools publication, which I said earlier is called The Southern Workman. The article only gives us the identity of one of the student actors, and it's this young man right here. And his name was Mandikane Sele, and he was a Zulu student playing the role of the king. So because he was Zulu, this means he comes from the modern day country of South Africa. There is another student who is mentioned as also being African, but specifically his name or where he comes from or which part he played in the production is not given. So we really don't know the identities of many of the people who participated here, but they're all students of Hampton. So also another thing to keep in mind is that the author of the article is a white woman. So definitely keep that in mind as I kind of provide a summary of the performance. And I think that is a relevant piece of information. So I'm going to use this text and then the photographs that we have of the performance as a way for us to think about it and interrogate what's going on here or the multiple things that are going on here. In the first scene, the audience is introduced to the setting of an African village that's made up of dwellings that the author designates using the Afrikaans term kraal, which is spelled K-R-A-A-L. So in the center of the scene here, we see a king, and we know he's a king based on his royal attire and the fact that he's seated kind of in an elevated position. And he's surrounded by women who the author describes as his, quote, obsequious wives. So not a very flattering description. The king is construed as greedily eating the food that's being prepared for him. when suddenly in bursts a group of his warriors who are carrying a message of threats that have been made by neighboring villages. After requiring allegiance from each warrior, the king then sends them on the warpath, is the exact quote that the author uses. The author then goes on to explain that the idea of impending violence delights the party, who dance around the king with great enthusiasm before departing on their mission. And then that scene concludes. So the next scene is kind of a morality tale concerning greed and avarice. A man from the village is seen sneaking into a woman's home to steal her bracelets. When the woman discovers her jewelry is missing, the so-called witch doctor is called upon to determine the thief's identity. After the perpetrator is declared to be among the king's warriors, the group decides that they're going to execute the thief. But they are interrupted before they can do so by a group of white men who are described as traders, Traders, traders. And this segment of the play concludes with the white men offering alcohol and European-style clothing to the amusement of the group. So the next scene opens onto a vignette of the witch doctor, who we can see here in the center, tending to an ailing warrior. His remedies appear to have failed, and as a last effort to save him, the witch doctor proposes the sacrifice of the king's son. So at the precise moment that the king agrees to the sacrifice, a courier arrives bringing news of a white man who is distinguished as good, in contrast to the earlier white characters in the story who were not described as good. This newcomer is able to heal the warrior through what the author implies is the use of Western medicines. After saving the life of the warrior, the white man earns the respect of the group, and he then shares the Christian gospel with them and tells them also about a, quote, Christ-like school for their people, end quote, in the United States. The king is so intrigued by this description of Hampton that he consents to send his son there as a student. I've not found any existing photographs that show the conclusion of this production, but the author shares that the scene opens to reveal that the traditional African characteristics of the original village setting have been replaced with architectural features that more closely resemble an American neighborhood. She suggests that this new architecture represents an improvement over the original African construction. And she describes the space as including a neat white cottage covered with vines, which echoes her earlier description of the school campus itself as being like neat cottages covered in vines. The author notes that now there's a single, neatly clothed wife who remains in place of the original many wives that were there. And the witch doctor has now become a bone setter. And the king himself is dressed in a Hampton uniform coat. Finally, the king announces that the whole village will be further transformed when his son returns with his classmates to establish a little Hampton in Africa. And so the play essentially seems to be saying, with its messaging, that just as the audience saw that Christianity can bring civilization to this fictional space, the school at Hampton will bring civilization to the real Africa. So tableaux like this pageant were commonplace in the early 20th century, as strange as something like this seems to us today. From the time of the Berlin Conference, which was in 1884 and 85, so the Berlin Conference can sometimes be made to seem more important than it actually was, because Africa was already being flooded with people from different European countries, or colonialism had been going on for a long time. But basically, the Berlin Conference is important because it's what formalized trade and colonialism in Africa. It was organized by Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor, and that's who you see here in this French political cartoon. And he is cutting up a cake that says Afrique on it, Africa. And you'll notice that in this picture, though it's a political cartoon, there are no African individuals present at the conference, which is true in real life. So no one who lived in Africa or was from Africa had any say in how this huge continent was divvied up amongst different European colonial powers. And so though there weren't any American colonies in Africa, there were American representatives present at this conference. And so The United States was very much complicit in this, even though there was no official colony. So anyway, I brought this up to say that from the time of this conference in 1884 and 85 until the end of the First World War, missionary pageants were usually part of larger missionary exhibitions that were especially popular in England. And so this is a photograph of a missionary pageant. My little Zoom box is kind of covering up. Okay, it's from 1908. So around the time period that we're looking at. British examples inspired at least one associated event in the United States that was held in Boston in 1911. And probably there were others, but this is like the one major example that I know of that fits in the model of these English ones. So African art played a crucial role within these missionary exhibitions. And unlike at Hampton, in England, these pageants were performed by white men and women playing the part of the Africans. Because of the wide attendance at such exhibitions, the missionary occupied a crucial role in the complex network of interests that cultivated an image of an Africa that was in need of salvation, both spiritually, materially, and culturally. While England and the southern United States had very different relationships to African colonialism, some of the similarities in these pageants make a closer examination of British examples worthwhile. In the British pageants, promoting artistry was critical for encouraging donations for new technical institutes to be established in Africa. A similar dynamic was at play at Hampton, which was itself a technical institute as well as a sponsor of African technical institutes. But we'll notice that with every glowing description of the Africans' great skill and artistry, it's tempered by a critique of their superstitions. And like the British counterparts, the Hampton pageant capitalized on humanitarian appeal. The evangelical message would have resonated with the majority Protestant audience and the Black student body. This pageant also makes an explicit connection between education and religion, which was a genre that would appeal even further to those individuals interested in donating financially to Hampton, including the 116 guests who had traveled from the northern United States to attend those 45th anniversary festivities. So details of the Hampton pageant are infused with new meaning when we consider them in relation to tropes of missionary pageants elsewhere. For example, we see things like this paternalistic concern for the Africans' relationship to European liquor. There's that allusion in the pageant and the liquors invoked as being explicitly introduced by white people. And viewing this reference from an American context, we could think of that white trader as a stand-in for a European colonialist who's interested only in Africa for economic gain, which was never something that an American would have done. You know, they're trying to present America as in a different relationship than Europe, even though there were a lot of the same things going on. So anyway, those economic traders in the pageant serve as a counterpoint to the later introduced American missionary who, despite, you know, some kind of paternalistic characteristics, is interested in the spiritual and the physical well-being of the people of Africa. Doesn't seem to want to take advantage of them economically. And so this is an intentional choice that was likely meant to remind the audience of the contrast between the atrocities committed against the Congo by secular Belgian entities and the missionary William Shepherd, who brought attention to those kinds of crimes. So the character of the witch doctor, which today that's not a term that we would use, we would call them like a priest or a diviner, but at the time they were called witch doctors. That character appears in the performance, and that's a common motif among missionary pageants at large. It was typical for missionaries to attribute what they saw as problems of African religious practices to this one scapegoat. Rather than applying these characteristics to all African people generally, they concentrated it on this one figure. So the pageant uses the witch doctor as the device to introduce these Western superstitions about Africa, like the idea of ritual sacrifice, which we know probably wasn't actually even ever practiced, and to mock that character for his belief in fetishes and incantations. So by concentrating their criticisms on the witch doctor and his violence, The missionaries are posited as offering the Christian religion as a more benevolent alternative to the African religion. The transformation of the witch doctor into a bone setter is also a metaphor for Hampton's belief in the triumph of Western knowledge structures over African ones. And I find it really striking that he's described as becoming a bone setter and not like, it seems to suggest that, well, he couldn't possibly become a medical doctor, he can only be a bone setter. In the early 20th century, the colonial incursion into Africa impacted emergent African American political thought, and many African Americans empathized with Africans in their forced position into second-class citizenry. Hampton, with its collection and pageant, illustrates the impact of American missionary endeavors in Africa upon the building of African American higher education. So while Hampton was not officially religiously affiliated, it was associated with a group called the American Missionary Association, which was a Protestant abolitionist group that was the impetus for founding many historically Black colleges in the United States. African Americans with strong ties to the church, including some of the students and alumni from Hampton, considered it their duty to intervene on behalf of Africans. And here, the students were active participants in a performance that portrays Hampton as a catalyst for moving Africa from what they saw as savagery to what they saw as civilization. This pageant represents the institution's interest in African culture and how it might enrich their pedagogy, while also desiring to correct certain behaviors and patterns that were highlighted by the missionaries. The play celebrates the uniquely American translation of the colonial project as lived out through missions, both among African Americans and abroad. Essentially, the messaging of this play is a justification for the existence of the school and its missionary activities in West and Central Africa. In the early 20th century, Black missionaries, such as those associated with industrial schools like Hampton, were frequently dependent upon the support of white Christians to facilitate their missionary presence in Africa. There would be a steady increase of Black evangelicals on the African continent in the first half of the 20th century, but the omission of a Black missionary character in a pageant at a school for Black students underscores what a precarious and unusual position that Shepherd occupied at the time. In fact, the Southern Presbyterian Church would only allow Shepherd to serve in the Congo if he was accompanied by a white missionary. The employment of the white missionary character is but one example of the complexities of African American higher education at this moment. In a 1918 letter, W.E.B. Du Bois strongly criticized Hampton as outmoded in comparison to progressive Black opinions on education. I'm sorry about the chainsaw noises. Du Bois described the institution, led by an almost exclusively white faculty and administration, as more celebratory of white philanthropists than of Black achievements. Speaking on behalf of African American intellectuals, he argued that, quote, "We do not feel at present that Hampton is our school. On the contrary, we feel that she belongs to the white South and the reactionary North," end quote. Du Bois' critique is salient in light of the fact that Hampton's pageant suggests that African Americans could do important work in Africa, but must first be trained by white Americans, just as Hampton's students were. Further, the pageant might be understood as a mode of instruction that tacitly told students to conform, while at the same time it told donors to the school that the school, and by extension the missionaries, do the necessary work for a unified and civilized America. American missionary activity in West and Central Africa formed the cornerstone of the original Hampton collection, shaped its pedagogy, and informed the school's larger ideology. The museum, its collection, and this pageant emphasize the complexities of Hampton as an institute of higher education. By our standards today, such a pageant is noteworthy and perhaps even a bit strange. For my dissertation, this performance provides an entree into what I hope will be a thoughtful analysis of the relationship between early collections of African art in the United States, the colonial missionary project, and African diasporic intellectual thought. My dissertation presents Hampton's collection of African art within the United States as the first of its kind, and one that importantly existed prior to other significant collections. So I'm including two slides here. So Alfred Stieglitz, who was a very famous American photographer, did not organize his show on African art at his gallery, which is the image you see here on the left, until 1914. And Albert Barnes, who's on the right, did not begin to collect African art until 1922. With the acquisition of Shepard's collection in 1911, this means that young Black Americans were among the first in this country to encounter African art as part of a dedicated collection that existed within a museum setting. So that's what I have for you all today, and I would love to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Mallory. Everyone, please, I know you have questions, thoughts, and Mallory's encouraged feedback. So not even if you just have thoughts that aren't questions, it doesn't have to start with who, what, when, where, why. Please do enter them in the chat box below. Mallory, I do have a question to kick us off. You were talking about the objects and the objects that were collected by Shepard were intended for these object lessons within the school. Was the pageant something that was in mind in that collection process, or was that something that was developed separately?
That's something I really don't know, and that I'm hoping I'll be able to find out when I'm able to eventually go back to the archives and do some more research, but there's really not a lot of writing about this pageant. But I don't know, I would think that he would have to know that that was something that was going on, especially given all these examples of missionary exhibitions and pageants that took place in the United Kingdom that I was talking about. I don't know that he would have chosen them hoping they would be used in a performance like that. Or if he just probably knew that might end up happening. And I will say also, I don't know if I emphasize this enough, the students don't appear to actually be using the objects from the collection in the pageant. I think they just made their own objects that were inspired by the collection. I mean, the shields are the biggest example to me, where it looks like they very clearly were exposed to those type of objects in the collection and were trying to create their own examples, because maybe they wouldn't have been allowed to use them in such a like public stagey type of way, even though it does seem like hands-on interaction was encouraged. That's another thing I'm hoping to find out is a little bit more about to what extent physical interaction with the collection was allowed.
Great. Paul wants to know if the school is still open.
Yes. So today it's called Hampton University, and it's in Hampton, Virginia. And like many historically Black colleges, with a few notable exceptions, it's pretty small today, but it has a beautiful campus, and they still have an art museum. It's actually in a different building than that photograph I showed you. This is really just a room. The original museum space. Now they have an entire dedicated building with a really rich collection of African-American art, as well as the Shepard collection, which is a lot of it's on display all the time.
Question from William: what Presbyterian body sponsored Shepard?
So it was the Southern Presbyterian Church, which I haven't researched this in a couple of years, but my understanding is that during that time period, there were two different like larger Presbyterian bodies, and the Southern Presbyterian Church was actually one that was not very integrated in comparison to whatever this other group that I'm blanking on, Presbyterian group. It was not like one specific congregation that sponsored him. It was like this larger body of the Southern Presbyterian Church. So it was like a conglomeration of many different churches, from what I understand. And the Presbyterian Historical Society is in Philadelphia, and I've also worked in those archives too. So they have most of his papers today.
Great school, great collection there. Great talk, Mallory! Exclamation point. Corky, great question. Who was the audience of the pageant? Was it done mainly for the school community, or was the public invited?
It was all of those things. I don't know if I have the numbers on who was there. So I believe I said this, but it's worth repeating. This was the 45th anniversary of the school's founding. This pageant was created in celebration of that. So the school had been around for 45 years. At this point in time, it was still a majority white faculty and administration, and a lot of white churches and different philanthropy groups were still heavily involved in the funding of Hampton at this time period. And so my understanding is that people traveled from all over the country to come to this event. And I'm not sure how many people would have been there, but there was the figure of 116 people who came from the North to see the production. So this would have been an event for alumni, for donors and sponsors, and the students who were currently in attendance at the school. So it was a big thing.
Great. You'll keep adding questions to the chat, or you can also unmute and shout them out if you would prefer voice. I'm curious about whether Shepard was intentionally collecting these objects. Do you know if he had any input in the curriculum development around these object lessons, or?
I don't think so. I just know that he used them like when he would, so I know I didn't say this, and I was thinking about it as I was talking that I didn't explicitly mention this, but so Shepard moves to the Congo in the 1890s. He stays there for roughly 20 years, but he would come back to the United States pretty frequently to raise money and then just, I guess, to return home to visit family. And so he would bring some of these objects with him. He would bring some of these objects with him when he would return to the United States, and he would use these, like he would travel and give lectures at churches and different event spaces, and he would use those objects kind of to be passed around to demonstrate where he had been and look at this incredible artistry of the people that I'm ministering to. So I think that he kind of like modeled how he hoped that they might be used, but I don't think that he would have had any say in the curriculum at the school. I think he just kind of hoped like, look at what I've been able to do with these objects, and I hope that you're able to do the same.
Susie and Michael, asked, what was the pageant a single event for the 45th anniversary, or was it repeated after that?
As far as I know, this was the single event that only occurred this one time, but from what I've been able to read, it seems pretty likely that a lot of similar type of events or pageants would have been performed, but I don't think that this particular pageant was performed more than just at this one anniversary event.
What size was the student body at?
I think I do have that written. Okay, so during this time period, there were about 1,200 students, and there had been about 1,700 students who had previously graduated from Hampton, but then there were 6,000 people who had attended some type of educational instruction at Hampton at that point, but hadn't necessarily graduated. So for instance, Shepard himself didn't actually even graduate from Hampton. He went there for, I think, 2 or 3 years, and then he transferred to a seminary. So that's why that's 6,000 is such a big number, and they didn't all graduate. A lot of people went to Hampton for a short period of time and then would go elsewhere because, as I mentioned, it was like a industrial technical institute. People who did want to go on to receive a liberal arts education, or who wanted to become like a doctor or a lawyer or a minister, would need to go elsewhere, at least during this time period. Today, it's a liberal arts university.
Great. Any other questions for Mallory?
Thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you learned something.
You'll please unmute, share with Mallory if you want to stick around for a moment, if you have an individual question. or thoughts, feedback, please do share it. Thank y'all so much for coming today. Thank you so much for letting me have lunch with you. Y'all be safe. Next week, I made a note. Next week is Mike Hansborough. Is that right? Yes. Kristen says yes. And he will be talking about natural resource conservation. So we hope that you'll be back for that. Mallory, thank you again so much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone
Have
for
a good
coming.
afternoon.
Bye.
That was great.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Karen, for taking over for Lindley.
Oh, no problem. My
I
treat.
appreciate It's good to see your face.
Yes, yours as well. Good to see everybody. Hope to see you next week. Mallory, thank you so much.
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah,
Bye.
good to see you. Bye.